Welcome back to the deep dive. We promise you a shortcut to getting your head around those really messy, complex, highly relatable emotional dynamics that, subtly shape our whole adult lives. If you've ever felt just fundamentally unseen in your relationships, maybe the close ones, or found yourself just pouring energy into getting through to someone who just seems, well, incapable of real emotional connection, then yeah, this deep dive is definitely for you. We are digging into a pile of sources today, really focusing on those relationships where the emotional wiring just never quite clicked. And look, because we want to keep bringing you this kind of insight, we do have a quick favor to ask. If this stuff hits home for you, please hit that like button right now. Seriously, it helps. And maybe drop a comment, share your first thoughts on emotional loneliness, maybe. And definitely bring in our community by hitting subscribe so you don't miss out on future discoveries. Okay, let's unpack this.
All right, so today we're really zeroing in on the long-term effects of growing up with emotionally immature parents, often profoundly neglectful ones. We're drawing quite a bit from the clinical insights and the detailed stories in Dr. Lindsay C. Gibson's work. Really helps people spot these toxic family patterns. And we'll be calling them EIPs throughout this discussion, emotionally immature parents.
Right, EIPs. And our mission today feels, well, absolutely critical. We need to understand why. Why do these specific relationships leave such lasting, kind of invisible wounds? We also really need to clearly identify the often baffling traits of EIPs, because honestly, once you can name the pattern, that's when you can start to break free from it.
Right.
And finally, we want to arm you, the listener, with some practical strategies, tools to reclaim your true self and start building genuinely mature reciprocal relationships.
Yeah, and at its core, an EIP is really defined by their lack of emotional responsiveness. They tend to fear genuine, deep emotion. They avoid self-reflection like the plague. And because of that, they rarely apologize sincerely or accept meaningful responsibility. In these kinds of family structures, the parent's own immediate emotional needs and, frankly, their survival instincts, they always seem to trump the child's need for a secure connection. The problem here is often quite subtle. And that's tricky, right? Because EIPs can look functional from the outside. They usually provide the physical stuff, food, shelter, basic safety. But they completely fail when it comes to making a solid emotional connection. And this failure to respond to a child's inner world, that's what we call emotional neglect. Sources confirm it's as real and as damaging as physical deprivation.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because the child isn't necessarily alone physically. They're surrounded by family, maybe, but mentally, emotionally, totally isolated. And the result of that missing connection is this lasting, really painful emotional loneliness. It can follow people right into adulthood and just completely warp how they even define intimacy.
That's exactly it. Emotional intimacy, in a healthy sense, it's the bedrock. It's that profound feeling of safety, knowing you can tell someone anything, that they truly see you for who you are, no judgment. When that bedrock is missing in childhood, well, that emotional neglect leaves this terrifying sense of core emptiness. It's deep.
And we see this isolation reflected so clearly in some of the real-life stories in the sources. Take David, for example. He described his childhood as just incredibly lonely, like I was utterly isolated. He said even when he was physically at home, with his family around, he felt like he was floating in the ocean with no one around. Just emptiness. And this wasn't like an occasional bad day for him. It was just daily life.
Yeah, that's powerful. And then there's a story of Rhonda. She was only 7 during a family move. She remembers standing by the moving truck, parents, siblings, everyone there. But she felt totally alone. Technically, she was with her family, but she felt she couldn't ask questions, couldn't share how anxious she was about everything changing. Her parents were just so wrapped up in their own stress, they were, in her words, totally unavailable. So Rhonda had to carry that huge burden, coping all by herself, and that crushing feeling of being unseen. That's the hallmark of emotional loneliness, no matter who's physically nearby.
Okay, so if these parents are often meeting the physical needs, what are the specific emotional giveaways, the hallmarks? How can we actually spot these core issues that make their behavior so, well, puzzling and often hurtful?
We've boiled it down to about 4 defining characteristics that tend to link these parents, regardless of their specific personality quirks. First one, egocentrism and self-preoccupation. They are obsessively monitoring their own needs, always kind of fearful of being exposed as inadequate. In pretty much any interaction you have with them, it all comes back to them. They're intensely self-referential, but crucially, not self-reflective.
Wow. So their entire world revolves around managing their own insecurity, basically, and the child's job becomes managing it for them.
That's often how it plays out, yeah. And that connects directly to the second trait, Low stress tolerance. EIPs are fundamentally reactive,
Hmm.
not responsive. When they get stressed, they often rely on denial or they blame others. They really struggle to regulate their own, often volatile emotions.
Hmm.
And they expect people around them, often the child, to soothe them, to fix it. Their coping mechanisms tend to distort or deny reality instead of actually facing it.
Okay. Third one, and this one feels like maybe the most deeply painful for the children we read about low empathy. The sources describe them as just strikingly blind to how their actions make other people feel. They lack something psychologists call mentalization.
Mm.
If we unpack that a bit, this isn't just about not being nice, is it? It's deeper.
Oh, much deeper. Mentalization is that fundamental ability to imagine that another person has their own unique, separate mind, their own perspective, different from yours. Lacking that means they genuinely can't grasp that your pain, your feelings, are separate from their experience or their discomfort. Their worldview is basically the only one that registers. And finally, all this leads to inconsistency and unreliability. Their moods can be wildly unpredictable, which keeps children constantly walking on eggshells. The sources mention Elizabeth's experience. She said she had to read her mother's moods constantly if her mom was positive. Okay, safe to approach, negative. Back off immediately. This inconsistency forces the child into thinking the parent's moods are somehow their fault, It makes them hypervigilant.
Right, always standing. Okay, so to help categorize this, the sources break EIPs down into 4 main types, though, many parents are probably a mix. First, the emotional parents. These are ruled by their feelings, prone to instability. They treat tiny upsets like the end of the world and pretty much demand others stabilize them constantly.
Yeah, very draining. Then you have the driven parents. These are compulsively focused on goals, achievement. They're often controlling, interfering. They value goals and performance way above actual feelings. And what's interesting here is the core wound isn't necessarily lack of attention. It's lack of feeling valued for who you are. The child, like John in one example, learns their worth is tied only to what they achieve. This can lead to lifelong perfectionism or sometimes, ironically, total lack of motivation because they feel they can never measure up.
Makes sense. Third type, passive parents. These folks have a kind of laissez-faire attitude. They just avoid dealing with anything upsetting. Often they turn a blind eye to really harmful family dynamics, maybe taking a backseat to a more dominant or even abusive partner. Molly's father is mentioned. He just happily puttered in the garage, totally ignoring the emotional chaos his wife or older sister caused. Never expected to step in.
Yeah, enabling by omission almost.
Hmm.
And finally, number 4, rejecting parents. These parents actively distance themselves. They show very little emotional warmth. They're happiest when left alone. Their tolerance for other people's needs, especially a child's needs, is almost zero. Their kids often feel like they're just bothers and irritants, like their very existence is an inconvenience. So when a child faces this kind of profound emotional loneliness, this sort of chronic threat to their sense of security, they naturally develop intense coping mechanisms. They have to find some way to connect. And the core strategy very often is learning to put the parents' needs first, basically seeing that self-sacrifice as the price of admission to even have a relationship.
Right, the cost of entry. And these survival strategies, they often seem to fall into 2 main styles, right? The internalizer and the externalizer. The internalizer, they're described as mentally active, sensitive. They tend to blame themselves. What did I do wrong here? How can I fix this? They suffer more quietly, which often leads to things like anxiety, depression, self-sacrifice, and eventually maybe resentment.
Exactly.
Mm.
Whereas the externalizer is more reactive, impulsive. They tend to assign blame outwards to other people, to circumstances anywhere but themselves. They avoid self-reflection completely. They act out their distress, maybe through, volatile behavior, rule breaking, sometimes addiction later on.
It sounds like the internalizer takes on this huge weight, almost hyper-responsible for everyone else's feelings. Is the research suggesting they're constantly trying to manage the parent's mood, or is it more about managing their own reaction to the chaos?
It's really both. But the immediate priority often becomes managing the parent's mood, because that feels like the key to finding some temporary safety or stability. And to actually function within this kind of volatile system, the child constructs what's called a role self. It's like a pseudo-self, a mask, that replaces their spontaneous, authentic way of being. They adopt this role to secure a predictable place in the family structure. And this role self gets propped up by something called the healing fantasy.
Ah, the healing fantasy. That sounds poignant.
It is. It's that optimistic but often totally unrealistic childhood story that gives them hope. It's the if-only narrative. If only I were perfect enough or selfless enough or successful enough, then my parent would finally see me, then they would finally love me the way I need.
God, that's tragic, isn't it? That very hope, that fantasy of getting the parent they deserve is what keeps people tied to these self-defeating patterns, sometimes for decades. And the role self just keeps demanding that performance, that perfection, long after the parent might even be out of the picture.
It absolutely does. And we see the cost of this play out in adult relationships all the time.
Yeah.
Think about Sophie's story. She'd been dating Jerry for 5 years, desperately wanted to get married. He finally gives her a jewelry box, and inside there's no ring, just a square of paper with a question mark drawn on it. Like some kind of cruel joke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she was devastated. But her EIP mother, when she told her mother sided with Jerry, saying the joke was funny. And Sophie had this awful realization she'd unconsciously picked a partner who was just as emotionally insensitive, just as lacking in empathy as her own mother. She'd basically recreated the emotional loneliness of her childhood.
Oof. That's rough. And then there's Jake's story, right? The classic internalizer. He was happily married to Kayla, seemed great on the surface, but he constantly felt exhausted, like he was faking it, always trying to be this super happy, upbeat guy he thought she wanted him to be. He eventually realized he was still playing the role he learned with his angry, critical EIP mother, the role where he had to perform perfectly, be cheerful, just feel adequate or safe. Even in his new, safe relationship, that old role self was still running the show, demanding this exhausting performance.
So the ultimate goal of healing from all this is about reclaiming that true self, that core part of you, your individuality that naturally seeks growth and authentic expression. Often, psychological symptoms like panic attacks, depression, chronic anger, these are actually the body and mind's way of setting up a flare, a kind of wake-up call signaling that the old, suffocating role self just has to be shed. It doesn't fit anymore.
Okay, so we've identified the problem, the patterns, the adaptations. The next big piece of the puzzle is, okay, what do we do? If we can't change the parent and the sources are super clear, you really can't, how do we actually shift the dynamic? The solution seems to lie in changing your response, not them.
Exactly right. This is where something called the maturity awareness approach comes in. It offers 3 key, really practical techniques. First, detached observation. This means you have to learn to view the EIP's behavior almost like, say, an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, non-judgmentally, just observing the patterns.
Right.
When you feel that old emotional distress flare up, that's your signal. It means your old healing fantasy just got activated. You started hoping, again, they'd suddenly be mature. You have to use that signal to pivot back to objective, detached thinking.
Okay, so instead of thinking, oh, why are they doing this to me again? It's more like, interesting, there's that egocentrism trait showing up. You become the observer, not the participant in the drama.
That's the pivot, precisely. The second technique is expressing and then letting go. This involves learning to communicate your truth clearly, intimately, but without judgment. But here's the crucial part. You immediately release the need or expectation for the EIP to hear it, understand it, agree with it, or change because of it. The goal shifts. It becomes about your self-expression, which you can control, not about getting a specific reaction from them, which you can't.
Can you give a quick example? Like, what's the difference between expressing your truth and just getting sucked back into the same old argument?
Huge difference. Expressing truth might sound like a calm, clear statement. I felt hurt when you dismissed my concerns earlier. See, it's controlled, non-judgmental, focused on your feeling. The old pattern, the one that feeds the healing fantasy, is engaging in the debate. You always dismiss me, it's unacceptable, you need to stop doing that. That second one is waiting, hoping, demanding they finally apologize or change. The first one. That feeds your true self by simply stating your reality without needing anything back. And the third technique flows from this, managing, not engaging. This means you focus on achieving a specific concrete outcome for an interaction like, say, having a short, relatively drama-free holiday visit. You focus on the outcome, not on fixing the whole relationship. You gently, persistently redirect the conversation back to your goal if it starts to stray. You politely resist getting drawn into emotional baiting or old diversions. EIPs often struggle against calm persistence and clear boundaries.
Annie's story really brings all 3 of these together beautifully, doesn't it? Her mother, Betty, was always emotionally insensitive. Famously made a really cutting comment right after Annie won an award. Then Betty refused to acknowledge the hurt, just gave Annie the silent treatment for months. Typical EIP behavior. But after learning these techniques, Annie decided to try the managing approach.
That's right. She invited her parents to her kid's soccer game. The objective was clear. A focused, drama-free visit centered on the game, not on rehashing the past hurt. During the visit, she consciously applied detached observation. She stayed pleasant but neutral, even when Betty started looking visibly upset and withdrawn, which was Betty's predictable way of trying to make herself the center of attention again, right? Pull focus through passive aggression. But Annie didn't bite. She didn't acknowledge or feed Betty's mood or her attempts at emotional baiting.
Yeah, she just kept the interaction pleasant, focused entirely on the shared outcome, watching the soccer game. And this led to Annie having this huge transformative realization. She said, "It's not about me. I'm finally figuring out that this is who my mother is. This is just her personality, her pattern, and I'm observing it." She could finally relate to Betty as just a fallible adult. She wasn't desperately seeking approval anymore from an emotional parent who, frankly, never existed.
And that really brings us to the core synthesis here. Understanding the EIP's limitations, truly accepting them as they are, it frees you. It frees you from potentially years of self-blame, guilt, and that crushing need to earn their approval. You start to gain real self-confidence by knowing the objective truth of your own story, your own experience. This shift allows you to relate to them, honestly, not as the idealized emotional parent you desperately needed as a child, but simply as a separate, complex, and limited adult.
And that awareness. Yeah, it can be painful to get there because it often means grieving the parent you deserved but didn't get. But it also grants this phenomenal gift. The sources suggest it gives you a kind of second life, the profound chance to fully step into and embody the person you were always meant to be, unburdened by those old suffocating roles and those endless healing fantasies. So is that path of awareness ultimately worth the pain it might take to get there?
From everything we see, it seems to be the only path to genuine emotional freedom.
Yeah, we certainly think so. And we really hope this deep dive has brought you some new clarity, maybe some aha moments. If this conversation resonated with you, if it maybe illuminated some patterns in your own life or relationships, please show your support, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us out. And if you have any thoughts on, say, the role self concept or the power of detached observation, we'd love to hear them. Share them in the comments below. And of course, if you want more deeply researched insights like this, stuff that helps you understand yourself and the world a bit better, definitely hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the next one. We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive.